The sun sets low over the distant Pacific, casting long shadows over the jagged cliffs of Saipan. The air, thick with the scent of smoke and salt, lingers in the wake of battle. Only days before, it had been a battlefield, the cries of war echoing off the rocks, the thunder of artillery pounding the earth. Now, in the aftermath, a tense silence hangs in the air, broken only by the soft shuffle of footsteps. Hundreds of weary, hollow-eyed men stand in a ragged line, surrounded by armed American Marines. Their faces are etched with disbelief, their hands trembling, unsure of what comes next. For so long, they had been told that surrender was a fate worse than death, that it was dishonor, a stain on the soul. But today, as they stand in the shadow of their conquerors, the reality of that belief shatters. The Marines, rifles steady but not menacing, do not sneer or taunt. There are no jeers, no cruel words, only quiet orders spoken in a language barely understood. A Marine steps forward, offering them bread and water, symbols of mercy, a plate of food, an act of kindness that defies everything these men were taught to believe. Private Shigeru Nakahara, his hands shaking, takes the cup. He drinks deeply, the cold water burning his throat, and with it, a sense of shame mingled with something else, a flicker of something he never expected to find here, among his enemies. For the first time in months, he feels human again. The summer of 1944 was a pivotal moment in the Pacific theater of World War II. Captivity. The brutal struggle for control of the Pacific Islands had reached a decisive point. The American forces, after years of bloody fighting, were advancing steadily towards Japan. The island of Saipan, located in the Mariana Islands, stood as one of the last major obstacles between the Americans and their ultimate goal, the Japanese homeland. The battle for Saipan was not just a military operation, it was a clash of cultures, ideologies, and an unyielding sense of honor that would define the soldiers on both sides. Saipan had been heavily fortified by the Japanese, and its defense was entrusted to thousands of soldiers, many of whom were conscripted young men. Like Private Shigeru Nakahara, who had left their homes in Okinawa full of duty and pride. For the Japanese military, the island's defense was a matter of national pride, and its loss would have profound strategic and psychological consequences. The Japanese soldiers, bound by an unwavering code of Bushido, believed that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. The imperial military doctrine was clear. To fall to the enemy alive was to forfeit not only one's life, but one's honor. By June 1944, the American forces, after weeks of brutal combat, had overwhelmed the island's defenses. The Japanese had fought with relentless tenacity, launching desperate suicidal charges to defend their position. But the cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost in the fighting. As the final assault on Saipan came to a head, the last pockets of resistance began to collapse. For the soldiers who survived, there was no clear answer to what would happen next. For many, the propaganda they had been fed throughout the war had created an image of their enemies as savage, dehumanized monsters. The Japanese government, through its state-run media, had painted the Americans as barbaric, merciless invaders. Surrender, in their eyes, was a fate worse than death. It was a myth, a survival mechanism, a cultural defense against the inevitable collapse of the empire. This ideology was so deeply entrenched that even as Saipan fell, Japanese soldiers held on to the belief that death in battle was preferable to the dishonor of capture. When the last of the Japanese forces on Saipan were surrounded and forced to surrender, they stood in disbelief. Their world, shaped by years of indoctrination and propaganda, was shattered by the reality of what they faced. The survivors, those too weak to continue fighting, could hardly comprehend the situation unfolding before them. There were no jeers from the Americans, no insults or cruel taunts. Instead, the Marines offered them a simple act of humanity: food, water, and medical care. For men who had been taught to view surrender as shameful, this act of kindness felt like an unbearable contradiction. Private Nakahara, one of those men, found himself in a moment of profound confusion. He had been ready to face the ultimate sacrifice, to follow his emperor's command without question, even if it meant death. But here, in the midst of what should have been his dishonor, he was treated with a humanity he had never expected to encounter. The world around him, once so clearly defined by the lines of war and duty, now seemed uncertain. What did it mean to survive? What did it mean to live when the very act of surrender had been declared an unforgivable sin? Shaken by this new reality, Nakahara and the other prisoners were ushered aboard American ships, destined for a place none of them had ever imagined, the United States itself. The voyage across the Pacific would not only bring them to a new land, but it would also be the beginning of a journey that would force them to confront the very essence of their identity, their culture, and their understanding of what it meant to be human. The journey that awaited the Japanese prisoners of war was unlike anything they had ever known. For most of them, it would be the first time leaving Asia. As the ships pulled away from the shores of Saipan and Guam, the prisoners looked out at the vast ocean. There was an eerie stillness to the air, a quiet broken only by the rumble of the engines below deck. For the men, there was no sense of freedom in the open sea. Instead, it felt like an endless, oppressive expanse, a reminder that they were far from home, under the control of their conquerors. Rumors swirled among the prisoners. At first, they had been sure they would be executed on the way to the United States. Propaganda had told them that Americans did not take prisoners. They butchered them, or worse, used them as subjects for cruel experiments. Now, aboard the ship, they struggled to reconcile the truth with the myths they had been fed. There were no signs of violence, no maltreatment. Instead, the Americans provided them with food, water, and medical care. It was a disorienting reality that felt like a dream, something they could not fully believe, but one they could not ignore. Private Nakahara, who had been reduced to a gaunt shell of a man during the battle for Saipan, found himself confused, yet grateful. He was alive, something that he had never expected to be after the fall of Saipan. For the first time in months, he drank water that wasn't tainted with salt, ate food that wasn't scraped from the earth or salvaged from the remnants of war. It was simple, the bread, the water, the cigarettes, but it was enough to revive him in ways he hadn't imagined possible. The cold, clean water burned as it went down his throat, a sensation so foreign to him that it made him weep. This was the first kindness he had received since being captured, and it was as profound as it was unsettling. Meanwhile, the ship, once a vessel of destruction, now carried something entirely different. Men who had been taught to see America as a land of evil, a place where enemies were not taken prisoner, but exterminated. Yet, in the silence of the hold, as they tried to adjust to this new reality, some of the men began to wonder, could the propaganda they had been taught all their lives have been wrong? Was the enemy as monstrous as they had been told? The contrast between what they had been raised to believe and the treatment they were now receiving created a growing sense of uncertainty, and for some, hope. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi, a seasoned officer who had survived the horrors of Saipan, gathered his men together as they crossed the vast expanse of the Pacific. Despite the strange mercy shown by the Americans, he held fast to the idea that surrender was an unthinkable disgrace. He reminded his men that they were soldiers of the Emperor, proud, honorable, and unyielding. But even as he spoke, he couldn't ignore the growing dissonance between the ideals he had fought for and the reality that surrounded him. There was no malice in the eyes of the American Marines who guarded them. There were no mocking words, no cruelty, just calm efficiency, following the rules. A stark contrast to the rage and bloodshed they had been taught to expect. As the ship sailed onward, Nakahara began to wonder about the land that awaited them. He had heard stories about America, but they were as distant and unclear as the horizon itself. Was it a land of barbarians? Or was it, as some of the men now suspected, a place where mercy and compassion were not weaknesses, but virtues? The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. How could his enemies, who had been so ruthless on the battlefield, now show him such unexpected kindness? Days later, when the ship finally approached the shores of California, the sight of America took them by surprise. It was nothing like they had been told. There were no towering, intimidating structures of war. There was no overwhelming military presence. Instead, there were green fields, small towns, and a landscape that appeared untouched by the devastation of war. The prisoners could hardly believe their eyes. This, they realized, was what they had been fighting for. A land that seemed as foreign to them as the enemy soldiers they had faced. This was the land of their conquerors. And yet, they found themselves drawn to it in ways they had never anticipated. As the ship docked and the prisoners were herded off onto American soil, They were greeted not with the contempt they expected, but with an unsettling calm. They were lined up, counted, and transported to a nearby camp in Wisconsin. The air was cold and unfamiliar, the land a far cry from the humid islands of the Pacific. As they entered Camp McCoy, the prisoners of war were processed with the same efficiency that had marked their journey. New clothes, new identities, new lives awaited them. They were no longer soldiers of the Emperor, but prisoners of the United States Army. Their fate, once tied to the will of their government, was now in the hands of their captors. The experience of captivity was not what they had imagined. The guards were not monsters. They were men, like the Japanese soldiers themselves, and this realization began to take root in the minds of the prisoners. No one shouted orders at them. No one beat them. They were fed, given medical treatment, and allowed to rest. The rules of war, so foreign to the Japanese soldiers, were now applied to them. The Geneva Convention, something they had never heard of, was in full effect. The shock of this new reality left them in a state of confusion. Was this still war, or had they entered some kind of strange peace? Private Shigeru Nakahara's world had been defined by sacrifice and duty. He had been raised to believe that surrender was an unthinkable disgrace, a betrayal of the emperor and his country. His honor had been tied to the willingness to die for the cause, to fight until his last breath. In Saipan, where the final battle had raged with relentless fury, Nakahara had felt his life slip away with each passing day. His body had become a mere shell, haunted by hunger and exhaustion. When the last shells fell and his rifle no longer fired, Nakahara was among the men who stood, trembling and disoriented, in front of their captors. As the American Marines approached, the terror that had gripped him during the battle began to give way to something else: uncertainty. In those first moments of capture, Nakahara, like many of his comrades, could not fathom why they were not being executed on the spot. The enemy, as they had been told, was supposed to show no mercy. Yet here, in the presence of the Marines, there was nothing but calm. The soldiers spoke gently, offering them food, water, and cigarettes. It was not cruelty, it was kindness. For Nakahara, it was a profound shock. His understanding of what it meant to be an enemy, what it meant to be human, began to unravel. It was a mercy he had never expected, and one he could hardly accept. As he drank the water and ate the bread, he felt a strange mixture of shame and gratitude. For the first time in months, he was not treated like a soldier, but like a man, something that felt both alien and comforting. From a purely tactical standpoint, the treatment of Japanese prisoners of war marked a sharp contrast to the brutal combat that had defined the Pacific theater. The U.S. military's handling of POWs was based on adherence to the Geneva Convention, an international law governing the treatment of prisoners of war that most Japanese soldiers were unfamiliar with. The Americans' decision to follow this protocol was not just a matter of legality. It also had a deeper strategic purpose. By treating their prisoners with respect and dignity, the Americans were not only maintaining moral high ground, but also sending a clear message to the Japanese military and its civilians that the United States was different from the enemy they had portrayed. The American approach to POWs had practical implications as well, providing basic medical care, food, and shelter to the prisoners, while keeping them relatively healthy and strong, allowed the U.S. military to use them as a source of labor. Many prisoners were put to work in support roles, unloading supplies or maintaining the camp. This tactic not only kept the prisoners alive, but also ensured they could be useful to the American war effort, all while preventing the immediate short-term backlash that could come from mistreating captives. Despite these practical benefits, the kindness shown to the Japanese prisoners had its own set of tactical advantages. The Marines and soldiers who guarded the prisoners were trained to avoid cruelty and maintain discipline, but they were also keenly aware that their actions were being observed by the prisoners themselves. The kindness of the American soldiers was something that would ripple through the minds of those in captivity, turning the narrative of their evil captors on its head. The journey of the Japanese POWs from the Pacific Islands to the United States was more than just a physical relocation. It was a symbol of the vast technological distance between the two warring nations. The ship that carried the prisoners was a military vessel repurposed for transport, its gray hull weathered by the salt of the sea and the scars of war. For many of the prisoners, it was the first time they had ever set foot on an American ship. The vessel, designed for warfare, now carried only the defeated, its engines humming with a sound that was mechanical. relentless, and disorienting to the men who had spent so much of their lives in a world of organic, unyielding traditions. For the Japanese soldiers, the American ships themselves were an artifact of the technological superiority that had already been displayed in the Pacific theater. The American military's reliance on industrial power had allowed them to outmatch the Japanese in nearly every way. Now, this very technology was being used to transport their captives, shifting the balance of power once more. As the prisoners sailed across the Pacific, they could not ignore the reality of the American military's technological dominance. Everything about the journey, from the precision of the ship's operation to the supply of rations and medical equipment, spoke of the stark difference in the resources and organization between the two nations. One of the most profound shifts in the minds of the prisoners came not from the acts of mercy shown by the Americans, but from the internal questioning among the prisoners' leadership. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi, who had once led men in battle with the certainty of a soldier loyal to the emperor, found himself in a moral quandary. The prisoners had been taught that death in battle was the highest form of honor, yet here they were, alive, fed, and treated with respect. The very foundation of his identity as a leader was shaken. Takahashi, who had maintained his composure throughout the battle for Saipan and during his captivity, began to question the ideals that had guided him. He reminded his men to stand tall, to maintain their dignity, and to act as soldiers of the emperor, even in captivity. But as the days passed, the influence of his captor's kindness began to wear away at the resolve he had once held. His conversations with Nakahara and other prisoners revealed a deepening uncertainty about the nature of the enemy. Takahashi was not alone in this realization. Many other senior officers, once steadfast in their loyalty to the emperor, began to see the Americans not as demons, but as human beings, a revelation that would have lasting effects on their post-war lives. From the American side, the treatment of prisoners was not simply a matter of strategy or morality. It was also a reflection of the broader mindset of the soldiers on the ground. The U.S. Marines who guarded the Japanese prisoners had been through their own brutal experiences in the Pacific theater. They had witnessed the horrors of war, and many of them had lost friends and comrades in the fighting. Yet, they were not the savages they had been led to believe their enemies were. Despite the ongoing conflict, these men saw their duty as one of following orders, not of inflicting cruelty. One Marine, Corporal Stevens, stationed at Camp McCoy, had seen enough death to last a lifetime. He had fought in some of the most grueling battles in the Pacific and had come to terms with the brutal realities of war. Yet, standing guard over the Japanese POWs, he was struck by a sense of common humanity. They did not seem like monsters. They looked like tired, beaten men. Men who had been ground down by the same war that had ravaged his own soul. For Stevens and his comrades, the prisoners represented not the face of an implacable enemy, but individuals. The kindness they showed, offering food, medical attention, and respect, was not just an extension of military protocol, but a human decision. The Marines' quiet respect for the prisoners, their awareness that these men were just like them, began to erode the hatred that had been bred by war. In some cases, bonds of empathy began to form. Stevens, like many others, found himself questioning the narratives of hate that had shaped his understanding of the Japanese soldiers. The true moral transformation within the camp, however, came from the realization that mercy was not weakness, it was strength. The kindness shown by the American soldiers had shattered the long-standing narrative of their brutality, and this shift in perspective altered the very nature of the prisoners' survival. The first meal they received in captivity, beef stew, potatoes, bread, and coffee, was not just food. It was an act of humanity, an unexpected offering of dignity. For the prisoners, especially for those like Nakahara, who had grown accustomed to starvation and privation, this was more than just nourishment. It was a profound demonstration of compassion, a reflection of the moral high ground held by the captors. In the context of war, where mercy was often perceived as a weakness, this act of kindness carried far greater consequences than anyone could have anticipated. The prisoners, who had once believed in the sanctity of their own honor above all else, found themselves questioning everything they had been taught. The simple yet profound act of feeding them, of giving them the time to rest and heal, stood as a direct contradiction to the inhumane practices they had come to expect from their enemies. This was not the cruelty they had been prepared for. It was a humanity that spoke louder than any weapon ever could. Lieutenant Takahashi, once a staunch believer in the necessity of sacrifice and obedience to the emperor, felt the weight of this moral dilemma more than anyone. The stew, the care, and the quiet dignity of the American guards made him realize that perhaps mercy was not a sign of weakness, but the strongest form of resilience. For Nakahara, the internal conflict was even more profound. To survive the war was one thing, but to survive it in the face of compassion from the enemy? This was a form of grace he had never anticipated, one that left him grappling with the shame of his previous convictions. As the days turned into weeks, the prisoners found themselves not just surviving, but learning. They began to question their place in the world, the meaning of honor, and the very nature of their struggle. Each meal, each act of kindness, slowly unraveled the rigid sense of loyalty to the emperor that had once governed their every thought. In many ways, the mercy shown by the Americans became the key to their own moral survival. For the Japanese prisoners, the real battle was not one fought on the field, but within themselves. Captivity posed a far greater psychological threat than the physical challenges they had faced during the war. Stripped of their identity as soldiers of the emperor, they were confronted with the difficult reality of who they were now. Prisoners of war. They were no longer soldiers. They were no longer fighting for any cause other than survival. The psychological strain of captivity was immense. Many of the prisoners, especially those who had been indoctrinated from a young age to uphold the ideals of Bushido, struggled with feelings of shame. They had been told their entire lives that surrender was not only disgraceful, but dishonorable. To be captured, then fed and cared for by the enemy, shattered the very core of their identity. For men like Takahashi and Nakahara, it was not just the loss of their comrades and their homeland that weighed heavily on their minds, but the loss of everything they had fought for. Their honor had been their shield, but now it felt like a hollow concept, a relic of a bygone world. The guards, who treated the prisoners with respect and even empathy, unintentionally became a mirror for the men to confront their own beliefs. They saw in the Americans not monsters, but human beings who had their own stories, their own families, and their own struggles. The prisoners had been taught to see the enemy through a lens of hatred and fear. Now, in the quiet rhythm of camp life, they began to see the enemy as equals, fellow men caught in the same global struggle. This shift in perspective, slow as it was, had a profound psychological impact. It was the beginning of an internal reconciliation, one that would reshape their sense of self for years to come. At the heart of this story was the clash between two cultures, the Japanese code of honor, based on sacrifice and loyalty, and the American ideal of mercy, freedom, and justice. For the Japanese soldier, their cultural upbringing had instilled a strict adherence to the principles of Bushido, the samurai code that emphasized honor, duty, and death before dishonor. Surrender was not just a tactical choice, it was a cultural betrayal, a moral fall. Yet, in the months following their capture, these same men were forced to confront the limitations of their cultural beliefs. The Americans, who had once been painted as savage invaders, now presented a starkly different model of behavior. The prisoners saw men who treated them with dignity, who followed a set of rules that governed the treatment of POWs. There were no arbitrary punishments, no beatings for minor infractions. Instead, there was a sense of fairness, even in captivity. This was a difficult pill to swallow. It was not just the physical hardship of captivity that wore on the men, it was the profound cultural shock they faced. They were no longer soldiers. They were now civilians in a strange land, governed by a strange set of rules. The traditional ideals they had followed, the ones that had shaped their understanding of life and death, no longer seemed as absolute. And as they began to adjust to the new rhythms of camp life, some of them started to heal, not just physically, but emotionally and culturally. They began to understand that survival, in the most basic sense, was not dishonorable. It was the first step toward peace. By the time the prisoners arrived in the United States, the initial shock had given way to a tentative sense of curiosity. They had begun to question the very fabric of their cultural identity. Could mercy be a form of strength? Could they survive this ordeal with their humanity intact? The experience of captivity in America became, for many of them, a journey not just of survival, but of transformation. It was a path that would challenge everything they had been taught about themselves, their country, and the enemy. The turning point for the Japanese prisoners came not in the barracks or during the mundane daily routines of the camp, but in a quiet moment that could have gone unnoticed by many. It was a gesture so simple, so small, that it could have been easily dismissed. Yet, for Private Shigeru Nakahara and the other men of Camp McCoy, it was nothing short of transformative. It happened during a routine meal in the mess hall. The day had started like any other. Roll call, a brief inspection, work assignments, but this time, something was different. As Nakahara stepped up to the serving counter, an American cook, a man whose name he would never know, looked him in the eyes. Their gazes met for a fleeting moment, and then the cook did something that made Nakahara pause. He placed an extra scoop of mashed potatoes on his tray, without saying a word. It was not an order or a command, but a simple act of kindness. The gesture was so unremarkable in the context of a normal life. But to Nakahara, it was profound. This small act, this moment of personal connection between captor and captive, was the culmination of everything the prisoners had been struggling with since their capture. It was a sign, a shift that marked the transformation from mere survival to something deeper, understanding. The realization that the enemy, the barbaric Americans they had been taught to hate and fear, saw them not as monsters but as men, was a revelation that none of them had anticipated. For Nakahara, this moment was more than just a plate of food. It was a mirror reflecting his evolving view of the world. The Americans had not only saved his life, they had begun to reshape his perception of honor and humanity. The shame he had carried since his capture, the shame that had followed him like a shadow, began to dissipate. The moment the extra scoop of mashed potatoes landed on his tray, something inside him cracked open. It was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding mercy, kindness, and the possibility of redemption. The internal conflict he had been fighting since his capture, whether to see the Americans as monsters or as men, was no longer a question of survival. It had become a question of the soul. Across the camp, Lieutenant Takahashi, too, felt the weight of this transformation. As a commanding officer, he had been taught to lead with authority, to instill discipline in his men, and to embody the honor of the emperor. Yet, in the face of American mercy, Takahashi began to wonder, could the emperor's honor be preserved in a world where mercy was the true strength? Could the same discipline that had driven him to fight be applied to the lessons he was learning in captivity? The moment Nakahara received his extra scoop of mashed potatoes was the tipping point. In it, the camp's daily routine, the rhythm of life that had slowly begun to normalize, suddenly felt like a life-changing crossroads. The lessons in survival were no longer the only lessons to be learned. The Japanese soldiers, once so sure of their purpose and identity, were now faced with the uncomfortable but undeniable truth. Mercy, when given freely, could carry more power than the sword ever could. As the weeks passed at Camp McCoy, the prisoners began to adapt to their new reality, each moment of peace and kindness unraveling the fabric of their former beliefs. The kindness of the American guards had begun to erode the thick walls of hatred and fear that the soldiers had been taught to erect between themselves and the enemy. The prisoners, who had once believed that Americans were cruel and dehumanizing, now found themselves caught in a paradox. They were living under the care of their captors, yet their captors treated them with a dignity they had never expected. One afternoon, as the men were gathered in the barracks, Lieutenant Takahashi addressed the group, his voice quieter than usual. He had been a proud officer, one who had led his men in battle with unwavering faith in their mission. But here, in this strange land, surrounded by enemies who showed them nothing but kindness, the world seemed to lose its edges, to soften in a way that felt unsettling. "We are not here to die," he began, his words slow, deliberate. "We are here to remember. Watch these people, learn from them. They have power, but they do not abuse it. There is something to understand in that." The men, who had once followed Takahashi's every command, now listened in silence. There was no immediate response, just the weight of his words settling into the quiet room. For many, this marked a profound shift, an acknowledgement that their captors were not just enemies, but human beings with their own code of ethics, their own sense of right and wrong. In a war where death was the ultimate sacrifice, mercy had been perceived as a weakness. Now, as they reflected on their experiences, the Japanese soldiers began to see mercy not as a lack of strength, but as a strength in itself. The psychological shift that had begun with the first acts of kindness, the extra spoonful of mashed potatoes, the offers of cigarettes and medical care, had snowballed into a transformation of their very identities. The pivotal moment came as word spread that they were being repatriated. The prisoners, now so far from the world they had once known, were suddenly faced with an uncertain future. They would return to Japan, but what would await them? How would they be received? For many of the men, this question was as heavy as the knowledge that their time in captivity had forever changed them. They were no longer the men who had left Japan to fight for their emperor. They had been reshaped by the experiences of captivity, by the mercy and dignity they had been shown by their American captors. When the final orders for repatriation came, the prisoners received new uniform, pressed and clean, marked with a red circle to signify their status as repatriates. It was a moment of closure and new beginnings, yet it was also a moment of deep reflection. As they prepared to leave Camp McCoy, the guards lined up outside to see them off. There were no salutes, no speeches, just a quiet, respectful acknowledgement of the men who had been through so much. Corporal Stevens, the American Marine who had been one of their guards, stepped forward. He had watched these men for months, seen their struggle, their confusion, and their gradual transformation. Now, as the men lined up to board the trucks that would take them away, he approached Nakahara, offering a simple handshake. "Good luck," he said quietly. Nakahara, still grappling with his own understanding of honor, bowed his head deeply in response. He had no words for this moment, no words for the strange, unexpected connection he felt with the man who had once been his captor. As the truck rumbled away from the camp, Nakahara and the other prisoners looked back. The fences, once symbols of their captivity, now seemed like distant memories, replaced by the road ahead. The journey back to Japan was long, and the men spoke quietly among themselves, reflecting on their time in captivity, on the food they had been given, the music they had heard, and the strange kindness of their captors. It was a surreal experience, a collision of worlds that none of them had expected, but that none of them would ever forget. When the men finally reached Japan, the destruction was overwhelming. Cities lay in ruins, the landscape scarred by fire and bombings. Many of the prisoners were greeted with relief, but for others, their return was not one of celebration, but of shame. The survivors of the war, those who had made it through the Pacific Campaign, were seen by some as symbols of disgrace. They had survived where others had died. They had lived where heroes had fallen. And with that survival came a heavy weight, a weight that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Private Nakahara, having returned to Japan, found himself torn between two worlds. He was not the same man who had left his home. He had seen mercy, experienced compassion, and tasted the sweetness of peace in the most unexpected place. Yet, the war had not ended in Japan the way he had once hoped. The emperor had surrendered, and the empire had crumbled. Nakahara, like many of the prisoners, had lost his former identity. He was no longer a soldier of the emperor. He was simply a man, a survivor, but one who had been irrevocably changed by the lessons of captivity. The aftermath of the war for the Japanese prisoners of war was as complex as the journey they had undergone in captivity. The men who returned to Japan, especially those who had spent time in American POW camps, faced not just physical but emotional battles. They had been shaped by the war, but they had also been reshaped by the mercy and kindness shown to them by the very enemy they had once been taught to hate. When they arrived back in Japan, the war was over, but the scars of it were not. Cities lay in ruin. The landscape, once vibrant with life, had been reduced to rubble. There was a deep, palpable sense of loss, both in the land and in the people. Families had been torn apart, neighborhoods obliterated by the relentless bombing campaigns. For those returning from captivity, the world they had known no longer existed. They were returning not just to a country that had been shattered, but to an identity that had been forever altered. The former POWs, who had once believed that their survival in war was a testament to their honor, were now viewed with suspicion by many of their fellow countrymen. To survive as a prisoner was seen as shameful by some, especially those who had died fighting or had committed suicide in the face of defeat. The idea of surrender, once considered the ultimate dishonor, now carried a different weight. Those who had lived to return were seen as survivors, but their survival often came at a cost. For Private Nakahara, the return to Japan was not a triumphant homecoming, but a confrontation with the reality of what had been lost. His own family, though relieved to see him alive, had a different kind of grief to bear. They had lived through the war, just as he had, but their grief was tied to the loss of the empire, and the sense of national pride came with it. Nakahara, with his eyes opened by the unexpected kindness of the Americans, was faced with the challenge of reconciling his survival with his past. He had lived through something that few could understand, and even fewer could accept. In the years that followed, many of the former prisoners, including Nakahara, kept a single photograph taken during their time in the American camps. It was a blurry image, but it held profound meaning. It showed the prisoners lined up for dinner, the first real meal many of them had eaten in months. In the image, Nakahara could see himself at the end of the table, thin and serious, holding a spoon. It was a moment frozen in time, a moment that encapsulated everything he had learned during his time in captivity, that even in the midst of war, mercy could be found, and it had the power to change everything. For Takahashi, the journey after the war was no less transformative. He returned to Japan and took up a position as a teacher, trying to impart the lessons of his survival to the younger generation. His students would often ask him about the Americans, about the country that had defeated them. Takahashi would pause, remembering the kindness shown to him and his men in captivity, before answering. "They were men just like us," he would say. "Some were kind, some were not. But they taught me something no victory ever could, that mercy is stronger than fear." As time passed, the trauma of war faded, but the lessons learned in captivity remained. For Nakahara and Takahashi, as well as the other men who had been captured and held by the Americans, the experience of survival and mercy became a quiet, profound thread that connected them to their past. It was a bond they carried with them into their later years, one that shaped not just their understanding of the war, but their understanding of what it meant to be human. In the years following the end of the war, the psychological and emotional reverberations of the experiences in American POW camps continued to shape the lives of many former Japanese prisoners. While Japan slowly rebuilt itself, the men who had returned from captivity found that the wounds of war were not easily healed, nor were they always visible. The true scars were internal, the struggle to redefine their identity in a world that had changed beyond recognition. For those who had been captured and held by the Americans, the journey of reintegration into post-war Japanese society was fraught with challenges. Many returned home to find that their survival, rather than being seen as a triumph, was instead viewed as a sign of dishonor. The concept of Bushido, the samurai code of honor that had dictated so much of their lives, emphasized death in battle as the ultimate expression of loyalty. To surrender, to be captured, was to fail in the most profound way. And so, many of the former POWs faced a harsh reality upon their return. They were no longer seen as soldiers of Japan, but as those who had failed. This internal conflict between the lessons of captivity and the harsh expectations of their society created a deep sense of isolation for many former prisoners. Nakahara, like many of his comrades, struggled to reconcile the mercy he had experienced with the ideals that had been instilled in him throughout his life. The kindness of the American guards, the compassion they had shown him, stood in stark contrast to the cruelty he had been taught to expect from the enemy. Yet, in the quiet moments of reflection, Nakahara knew that he had been irrevocably changed by what he had experienced. His survival, though once seen as a matter of duty, now carried with it a burden of understanding. Years later, when Nakahara and Takahashi met again by chance in Tokyo, their conversation was filled with quiet reflection on the war, their survival, and the strange kindness they had found in captivity. They spoke of their families, of peace, and of the strange experience of being treated not as enemies, but as human beings. They shared memories of their time in the American POW camp, and the food they had been given, the conversations with the guards, and the unexpected moments of humanity that had become part of their survival. "I still remember that first meal," Nakahara said, his voice soft with nostalgia. "It changed me. It made me see them not as monsters, but as people." Takahashi smiled faintly, his eyes far away. "Yes," he replied. "That meal was the first time I felt free, even behind a fence." In that moment, they both understood something that no victory on the battlefield could have ever taught them. It was the realization that compassion, even in the darkest of time, could restore humanity. That the enemy, whom they had once been taught to see as subhuman, was capable of showing the very mercy that could heal not just physical wounds, but the soul itself. For many of the men who had returned to Japan, the memory of their time as prisoners of war remained a quiet part of their lives. It was not something they often spoke of, and it was not something that was widely understood. Yet, the lessons they had learned, the power of mercy, the dignity in survival, and the recognition that even enemies could show compassion, were lessons that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. In the years that followed, Nakahara kept that photograph from Camp McCoy close, a reminder of the man he had been, the man he had become, and the bond he shared with the men who had once been his enemies. The image captured a moment of profound change, a moment that had transcended the boundaries of war and humanized the very men who had been taught to hate. Nakahara never forgot the stew that had filled his stomach on that first night, or the strange sweetness of peace hidden inside a spoonful of food. The kindness of the American guards, once viewed with suspicion and disbelief, had become a symbol of what humanity could be in the most unexpected of circumstances. It was a symbol that transcended the brutality of war, and one that Nakahara, along with his fellow prisoners, would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As time passed, Nakahara and Takahashi continued with their lives, their experiences of captivity lingering in the background, quietly shaping the way they saw the world. And though they were no longer soldiers, no longer bound by the duty to die for their emperor, they had learned something far more enduring, that mercy, when given freely, could be more powerful than any weapon. That even in the darkest of times, compassion could create a bond that no war could ever sever. The story of the Japanese prisoners of war in American captivity is not one of mere survival, but of transformation. In the crucible of war, where ideologies were forged and broken, these men were forced to confront the deepest contradictions of their beliefs. They had been raised to see the world through the lens of duty, honor, and sacrifice. To surrender was to forsake everything, life, identity, and the very core of who they were. Yet, in the unexpected mercy shown by their captors, these men discovered something far more powerful than death on the battlefield: humanity. For Private Nakahara, Lieutenant Takahashi, and the others who endured captivity, the most profound shift came not in their bodies, but in their hearts and minds. The meals they ate, the small acts of kindness from their captors, were not just gestures of survival. They were the seeds of a new understanding of what it meant to be human. The soldiers who had once believed in a world where mercy was weakness now found themselves learning from the very people they had been taught to hate. They saw in their captors not monsters, but men, fellow humans, caught in the same tragic war. What began as a journey of survival turned into a journey of self-discovery. Through the eyes of the enemy, these men saw that compassion, kindness, and mercy were not signs of weakness, but of strength. The image of the American Marine who had given Nakahara that extra scoop of mashed potatoes, a simple act of nourishment, became a symbol of a much larger truth, that even in the most brutal of circumstances, there is room for empathy. It is the simplest, yet most profound, of human qualities. The legacy of that moment stretches far beyond the walls of Camp McCoy. It is a reminder that even when history turns violent, even when cultures clash and nations are at war, mercy has the power to cross every boundary. Compassion is stronger than hate, and kindness can undo years of conflict, even in the most unimaginable of ways. In the end, the story of these prisoners of war is not just about the horrors of war, but about the human capacity for change. It is a reminder that survival is not merely a matter of endurance, but of evolving into something better, something more humane. It is a story of how, even in the most unlikely of places, humanity can shine through. When Nakahara and Takahashi met years later, it was not as soldiers, but as men who had learned the power of compassion. In the quiet of their reunion, as they shared memories of their time in captivity, they understood that the greatest victory of all was not the one fought on battlefields, but the one fought within their own hearts. the victory of mercy, which had the power to heal not just the wounds of war, but the very soul of humanity. This lesson, small yet monumental, continues to resonate today, that even when all seems lost, even in the darkest chapters of history, kindness can outlast any conflict. It reminds us that empathy is not just an act of resistance against hate. It is the path to healing and understanding. And so, we are left with a quiet, enduring truth. Mercy does not make a man weak. It makes him human. In the face of war, it is compassion that defines us, and it is compassion that will carry us forward. The end.